Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Massa. I'm an investing reporter at Bloomberg News. And today we're going to talk about the thinking behind sustainable investing. What an investor chooses to buy or sell is all psychological. And today we're going to drill into the decision-making process that goes into sustainable investments. With me today, I have Dr. Cait Lamberton, a distinguished professor of marketing from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining me today, Cait.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start out with a polling question. And I'll just remind everyone, go into your app. The question should appear and you can vote. The question is, talking about climate change makes me feel helpless, empowered to take action, paralyzed with fear, or unaffected. So take a minute and respond in the app. Empowered to take action. Wow, we've got a very can-do group here. With a few people feeling helpless, but very few people paralyzed with fear, so that might be good. So as we even out here, Cait, what is going on here? How do these feelings really affect sustainable investing?
Yeah, so this is fascinating because if I gave this poll to a bunch of undergrads, this is not what they would say, right? We actually just collected some data among undergrads. We were talking about this earlier. And it's really interesting. So what they feel is that, yes, in 30 years, technology is going to be completely different. We won't even recognize the world that we're in. But if you also ask them, will we have more resources, the same amount of resources, or fewer resources, they say fewer. So basically what they're seeing is, okay, we're going to use technology to fight over a dwindling pool of resources, right? And that's a very different feeling, right? That feels like, yes, if we're empowered to basically survive. But are we really empowered to make anything better? Unclear, okay? Now that's data as of yesterday from undergraduates. So you're living in a different space than those people are. And it's wonderful that we feel empowered in this room. Somehow we have to get that over the bar. And that's a trick, obviously.
So there's a real divide in age then?
There could be, right? So we had a slide, if we could toss that slide up there. I know people talk a lot about generational differences, and of course those are real, but what I would argue is that those are only important in as much as you can count on those demographic differences as a meaningful proxy for an underlying psychological difference. There's heterogeneity in any demographic group, okay? So, so what we could do is we could think about people, rather than getting sort of hung up on these generational differences, we can think about the psychological differences. And so a very simple framework would have us think about investment in terms of openness to green behaviors, and we have scales to measure this in general, and their level of experience with investing. Now you can imagine that you might actually have some younger people who are quite experienced for some reason, but who feel negatively toward green investing because they've developed a high degree of skepticism about it. Now I'm a Gen Xer, so we're skeptical about everything. Yeah. But you could find people of different ages in any of these cohorts, and you would want to interact with them differently. And again, if you find it useful to use demographics as a proxy, you certainly can. Sometimes that will work for you, but very often there's more heterogeneity within a single group than we want to recognize, and we miss an opportunity when we do that.
So how do factors like age and financial stability and past investment experience really play into how you might approach a potential investor in a sustainable product?
Yeah, I mean, you have to change, I would argue, in an ideal world, a lot about your approach. Specifically, we find that a lot of things have to change when people face a different sense of scarcity. Subjective scarcity, and as you probably all know, even very wealthy people can feel a high subjective sense of scarcity, right? You can have a lot of money in the bank and still feel like you do not have enough, and that profoundly changes your decision making, okay? Because your attitude toward risk is different, your interpretation of information is different, and your what we would call a promotion as opposed to a prevention focus is different. So people who face high scarcity tend to kick into a prevention focus. So for these people, the world is not about how do I make the world better, but how do I avoid making the world worse? And that's a very different mindset, right? So what I find really interesting about the communication related to some of these funds is that, first of all, the language that's used across companies is very uniform. We're all talking about them in the same way, right? In this marketing 101, you're not differentiated. So if I go on to website A and they talk about sustainable, responsible investment, the language is, I mean, the words are almost the same, right? And so if you have people who are in a very prevention-focused mindset saying that you're going to leverage your expertise and your data and your wisdom to maximize, that's not the language for them, right? If you're in a prevention-focused mindset, you want to hear that, you know, we're going to do things that keep us safe, that protect us, that are actually safer in the long run. And we don't, we just use the same language like it's for everyone. So I think scarcity, financial constraints have a huge effect.
So you can't use one uniform message for all of these different kinds of investors.
Not in an ideal world, right? I mean, again, it's marketing 101. And we know that people are driven by different things. And often for the consumer, you know, the retail consumer, they face a really different decision-making challenge. So for an institutional investor or an employer who needs to justify where they're putting their money, they're going to be pretty interested in data, right? Because that is something they can use when people ask them why they made a choice. That's how we justify choices in the business world. Nobody's really going to ask me personally why my 401k allocation looks like a train wreck, right? It's not going to be a discussion I have to have. So data has to play a different role. It's not so much for accountability. If anything, it has to make me, you know, it has to be resonant, it has to be clear, it has to be simple. But it's not the same animal, even though it can be the same data.
Sure.
Yeah.
And stepping back for a minute, how do you identify a customer of any kind who might be interested in the idea of sustainable investment?
Well, I think you guys, I'm sure a lot of you already do this. So if you look at data and you see complementary behaviors, right? So you're going to see people who are perhaps also buying seventh generation products, right? Who are buying sort of eco-friendly goods, who are perhaps, I think you can also do this geographically in some cases. You can find areas where it's simply part of the dominant culture to have eco-friendly behavior be very salient, right? So right now I'm on this really interesting panel at the National Academy where we're looking at food waste specifically. And this may feel like a stretch, but bear with me for a second. You know, as some of you from the West Coast know, there are places where you pay as you throw. And so people become very conscious of what they dispose of. It's an everyday part of their decision-making process to ask, is this something I could reuse? Is this something that I could keep? Is this a scrap that could be made into something else? In those areas, this is just part of the habitual thinking process in a way that it might not be for some of us in other places. Yeah.
And so jumping off of that, if you take something like climate change, how do you talk about it in a way that's not depressing or, like you mentioned with those younger students, that doesn't make you feel at sea and unable to act?
Yeah, I think this is a problem. So it's interesting. I think that we, in marketing at least, have relied a lot on repetition, and we know the science is there. Repeating things is good, but what also happens is that if you've given me the option to do something 7 times and I don't do it, all I've done is signal to myself that I really don't want to do it, right? So we look at our own behavior as an indicator of our interest. So we have to be a little bit careful about continually pounding people at the wrong moment and in the wrong time. So if we are sticking with a given message and we're saying we're going to play the exposure game and it's not working, you may be doing more harm than good. Because they're just going to interpret that as, this is not relevant to me. If it were relevant to me, I would have taken action. Okay, so I think that we have to be a little more creative than that. Certainly things that are compelling are things like concrete success stories, right? Everybody remembers a story. We know this. So if you were to say, listen, by shifting from X to Y, here's what happened, right? Here's what happened in the world. When we do research, we have to make this argument all the time because a lot of our research people see as sort of, you know, abstract and not speaking to the practical world. And so what the line that we have to take is, okay, we thought A. Because of A, we did B. Because we did B, we learned C. And because we learned C, we change practice. We change the world. But if we don't get to that C, like what actually changes in the world, then the A and B matter much less. Okay, so at the end of the day, the question for the consumer has to be, if I do this, what changes in the world? What will be different because I took this action? And it doesn't even have to be something large. It has to be something concrete. It has to be something that's salient, visible, perhaps something they can discuss with other people, But if you don't get to that, this is why this changes the world, then this other part doesn't really matter. All of your knowledge, all of your statistics, all your data is not particularly compelling to at least a chunk of your retail investors.
And in getting a story like that out, how might the content or the tone of it differ based on the different customer that you might be addressing?
Yeah, so what we try to push for in most cases is this sort of concrete angle. And what you want is something that's highly self-relevant, which sounds like no doubt, but we do it wrong all the time. So for me, I'm going to care more about stuff that's local to me, that happens with regard to people who I have something in common with. And again, that doesn't have to be demographics. So it's something that comes home that I feel like I could hold in my hand or that I could walk around and see. So do you have to know your consumer to do that? Yes. Right? You have to know what they actually care about. Because again, if you tell them, because you shifted your allocation in way A, the world changed in way B, and that way B does not matter to me, you've actually just given me bad feedback. You've told me you did something that had an effect about which you didn't care. You didn't have to do that. You probably wasted your effort, right? That's not useful. It's actually anti-useful, right? You have to figure out what the B prime is, right? What the thing is where they say, oh, I'm glad I did that. And even better, there wasn't any other way for me to do that, right? So I think what is really exciting about the field that you're working in is the scale, right? This is the wonderful thing about having retail investors involved. I myself can only do a little tiny bit, right? If I participate in something bigger, that's really profoundly moving. And you see people that are willing to suffer to do this. There's even some work that can go into it, right? So I think that communicating in a way that's self-relevant and emphasizing the power of scale and combined effort can get you a lot farther than giving general feedback that may fall very flat. Yeah.
So acknowledging that the impact that you can make might be very small, how do you still take that and make it seem motivating?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. One is this aggregation angle, which is to say, because you and a million other people did this, we could create this change. Another tool that's often used when sort of the quantifiable change is small is to talk about the percent change, right? So, maybe you only change something by 20x, fill in your unit. But last year you changed it by 2. Okay, so what you've done is you have actually increased the effect by many percent. So you can sort of switch it, put it in a frame that shows that something is changing here that does matter, that is big. Sort of a framing issue, but I think it's very possible.
And how do you address the fact that sustainable investing is not a magic bullet? It's not the only way forward.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. We were talking about this a bit while we were waiting. There are a lot of behavioral change movements that I think could be considered analogous, right? So when I was a small child, 1,000 years ago, the idea of wearing a seatbelt was actually kind of an optional idea, right? So my mother, for some bizarre reason, was anti-seatbelt. I don't know. Like, what sense does this make? Right?
Anti.
Actively anti-seatbelt. This seemed like, because then you're trapped. You can't get out of your, anyway, whatever. But what happened was there was a movement. There was a movement whereby it suddenly became weird not to wear a seatbelt. You got in the car and you didn't put on the seatbelt. What's wrong with you? Like, you don't like your life, right? Like, what's actually wrong with you? So what happened? What created that change? There were massive public health campaigns, but more than that, it just became a thing everybody did. It became a habit, right? We've created new habits around consumption. So, phone, wallet, keys, right? These are the things you have to do before you leave. You don't even have to think about them anymore. We could look at movements like the movement to stop drunk driving, okay? Was it all the statistics about how bad it is to drive drunk that motivated anybody? No, it really wasn't. Those statistics, again, were useful at an institutional level to get money for the programs. Okay, so at an institutional level, it's really important. But at an individual level, what happened? You just became kind of an idiot if you did it, right? There is a lot of power in making something a social norm. And again, I think you have a fantastic opportunity here, because to say, well, why would you put your money in things that don't do any good? Like that's actually, it doesn't even sound rational, okay? And I think you also have an interesting opportunity because What many people are now convinced of is that however it's being caused, climate change is happening. Like that is actually a sure thing. How many sure things about the future do we have? We have really few. Like I don't even know what I'm doing next Tuesday. Okay? But we do know that climate change is happening. So if somebody can invest in something that is related to a sure thing, that feels like investing in a sure thing, right? So I think there are ways to get around this sort of, well, it won't make any difference, and I haven't done it before, because of the moment we're in. And I think, again, these analogous movements can give us some clues about what will work and also what we have to avoid. You do have to avoid greenwashing, right? You do have to avoid skepticism. You certainly want to avoid looking like you're inauthentic. That's going to create a problem.
How do you do that? How do you avoid the problems that come along with greenwashing?
Yeah, you have to really do what you say you're doing. I mean, it's a simple answer. So I just reading some research yesterday about corporate pro-social actions. And, consumers are pretty smart people. If they look at a corporate pro-social action and they say they just did that to make money, you don't get many points for it, right? Because it's extrinsically motivated. It doesn't give you a clue about what the moral status of the firm is. However, interestingly, if that gain that the firm stands to make has any uncertainty associated with it, if they realize that you are also taking on some risk, then you get the moral credit. Then they say, okay, that probably is something that means something to the firm. So in that sense, I think that there's a way to say we're all in this together, right? That can be truly genuine and can read as genuine. Because I don't think it's the case that every firm that makes money from this kind of investment is not sincere and genuine. But that will not be communicated if it's too easy to say it's just for the money.
Right.
Yeah.
Other historical analogs. How do recycling and things like smoking cessation fit in?
Yeah. So again, I don't know if I wish we could ask here if anybody had ever gone through smoking cessation programs. What they'll tell you in those programs that this is an incredibly hard behavior to change, right? And that turns out to be true. And yet, what happened in New York a few years ago? They're like, you just can't do that here. You're just going to have to stop. And when we introduce an innovation in an environment where it is normative to adopt the change, we make our lives a lot easier. Now, in many ways, the voices in this room set the norms, right? You have such power to present what a typical investor looks like, to present what the ideal investor looks like, and to have people listen. So what we find is that when there's a desirable identity that people have an opportunity to be part of, they will behave in ways consistent with that identity. We learned a lot of this when doing research with students. So, for example, if you say the best students do X, Y, and Z, suddenly people want to do X, Y, and Z. It's a funny thing. Other things that can be done that are analogous. So one of the big challenges that we worked on was getting students to fill out the free application for federal student aid, which I'm not sure if you filled it out recently, but it's a pain. Right? It's miserable. I
remember that.
I have friends who are just like, we're just not going to bother. Right? It's actually not worth the money. And so in that circumstance, what we were able to do was to convert that action into a currency that students cared about. So we could say, for example, you can spend 1 hour on this, or given the average amount of money people usually get from it, you can work 26 40-hour work weeks. Would you rather spend an hour? Right? So what we did there is we created a currency. So you can say to people, would you rather allocate and be part of this movement, right, that's actually changing the world, actually opening things up to a better future than you think is even possible right now? Or would you rather just kind of sit back and watch it happen, right? Would you rather perhaps save up all of your dimes and maybe by the end of your life, you individually can plant a couple hundred trees? Or you work with us and you're part of this much bigger thing. When people see that what they're doing actually has a much bigger payoff, then it's pretty compelling, right?
So that comes back to what you were saying about making actions concrete.
Yeah,
what you're doing with this 1 hour could have such a major impact down the road.
Yeah, and time is a thing that people can't make more of. Okay, so I know folks were talking a bit about the idea of retirement, and retirement is very abstract for people. But I started doing some work on this. When you give people the opportunity to retire 6 months earlier, that means something, right? 6 months is time. I can't make more time. I have in my head that I will have more money because everybody believes they're going to have more money in the future, right? We're all pretty optimistic about this. But time, I have it or I don't. So if you can make people feel like they can get time,
that's empowering.
They're fairly motivated, as it turns out, you know.
And what are some of the most common mistakes you'd say you see in communicating the need for responsible investing and actions?
Yeah, I think that what I see is a lot of language that made a lot of sense when we were all in a meeting room or a boardroom. It made perfect sense. It's beautiful. All the words are there. All the shibboleths are there. Like, we all know what we're talking about. But it's the same mistake that car makers make. So probably this weekend, many of you saw automobile ads, right? And they probably looked about the same, right? It was, oh, here's a car. We're going to give you a close-up. We're going to show you the tires. We're going to show it going around the coast somewhere lovely in California. And then we're going to flash up the APR and some other information. And maybe if you're watching some local station, you'll see some dealership with balloons and stuff. Okay. 5 minutes after that ad came and went, you have no idea what car that was. They all look exactly the same. I mean, did engineers spend thousands and thousands of man hours? Is there tons of science about why that's a better car? Is that a really good financial deal? Maybe. It's completely undifferentiated. And I have a friend who used to be a marketing executive, and he retired some years ago, but he said it's car porn. Like, it's automaker porn. They love those ads. Everything is right in those ads. And oh my gosh, you should have seen how much work it was to get the helicopter to fly over and get this angle and the whole thing. But they don't even leave a mark on us, right? Please don't do that. Like, the minds that you have access to, the creativity is enormous. And so that's the mistake that I love to see avoided. And if that means taking a few chances in terms of messaging, I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it to take ideas from, far distant fields. See what gets your attention and just try it. It's cheap enough now to do A/B testing on messages. You may as well try it and get away from, let's call it ESG porn if we have to. Right? All very the same.
So with that, I think that we're out of time. Avoid the ESG porn. Thank you so much for joining me today, Cait. And thank you all for listening.